Hello and welcome to A Day in the Life. My name is Fred Hacker. I'll be your host, and this is the 107th program in this series. We want to thank our series sponsor, Bales and Dishaw Wealth Management, who every time we produce this program are standing behind us, providing their support. We also want to thank Arnold and Patty DeCarly, who are the sponsors for this particular edition of A Day in the Life. I'd like to remind you that we have an upcoming program in a couple of weeks. My guest will be Canadian actress Sheila McCarthy. But right now, it's my great honor to introduce to the program the 16th Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable Joe Clark. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Fred.
It's really great to see you again. We seem to get together about every 40 years.
Yes, that's right. We'll keep doing that.
Yeah, right. Well, this program looks at your life, sir, in a chronological way, and we really like to emphasize the influences on your life, the people and the circumstances, the events that led to your highly successful career in Canadian politics. So let's begin at the beginning. Tell us about where you hail from.
I was born in a town called High River, Alberta, south of Calgary, I have a younger brother, Peter. My dad was a weekly newspaper publisher in High River and Okotoks and Vulcan. His father before him was. His father came out from Kincardine, Ontario, because there were too many kids to each run the farm, and came out to High River. He came, interestingly, by way of South Africa, because he had applied to join the army in that war at the turn of the century, but was too young, so was sent to look after the horses. And as soon as he got there, he pretended he was older than he was, and served a couple of years there. So those are my origins.
Now you had a stint in journalism yourself, and we'll cover that later. But obviously, your father's influence led you in that direction.
Yeah, and there's an interesting Alberta angle to this, because my grandfather bought the paper from the famous Alberta editor Bob Edwards, who ran the High River and then the Calgary Eye Opener, and he was always in trouble, was Bob Edwards, and he literally got thrown out of town, out of High River in 1904 or 5, and he stopped in Okotoks, where my grandfather was running a paper. He stopped there in part because he knew there was a bottle of whiskey in my grandfather's drawer. And he said to my grandfather, "Charlie, I think there's going to be an opening in High River." So the Clarks moved to High River at that time.
Fascinating. Now, your mother, Grace, what was her background?
She was a teacher, a high school teacher, raised in Wainwright, Alberta, and a very successful teacher, and obviously they were both, I have to say, great parents. They were to me, they were to Peter.
You attended primary and secondary school in Alberta.
In High River, yeah.
Any inspirational characters along the way there?
Oh, there certainly were. I mean, there were neighbors, for one thing. Bill Mitchell, W.O. Mitchell, lived down the street from us.
Really?
Indeed, anyone interested in tiny, irrelevant details who buys his first book, Who Has Seen the Wind, on the jacket cover, he's seen smoking a pipe, but he didn't smoke a pipe. The photographer, however, insisted. So he said, "Well, my friend Charlie Clark smokes a pipe." He went down and borrowed my dad's pipe. And that was as close as we got to fame as a writer. But, and we had great teachers in High River. I'm not sure all the reasons, but part of it was relative proximity to Calgary, to a city, but also it's a beautiful part of the country. And in its own way, a quite cultured part of the country. It had been influenced heavily by a lot of the so-called remittance men from the UK who'd come out as ranchers. Right. And they were pretty good ranchers, better ranchers than their reputation. They also were connected to a much wider world. And back in that time, that was a relative rarity in a smaller Alberta town. So I grew up with all that tradition. And I guess the other thing that was important to me was that both my dad and my grandfather were very active in the Canadian Weekly Newspapers Association. My grandfather was national president, my dad provincial president. And that meant that we had weekly newspaper editors from literally all over the country coming to visit us on the way to or from any national conventions that had been held in Western Canada. So I met all these characters, and it was a great upbringing.
Tell us about your university education.
I went to the University of Alberta, in part because it never occurred to me that I could go anywhere else. It was the Alberta University, and off I went, and earned a BA there, and many years later earned an MA. I think I broke the rules in terms of the length of time it took me to write my MA thesis, but by that time I was in the House of Commons and I think got the benefit of the doubt. So, but I have a BA from there, an MA. I was very privileged to edit the University of Alberta newspaper, student newspaper, The Gateway, and had great fun doing that.
Often the most interesting characters on a university campus gather around the newspaper office. Was that the case at the Gateway?
It was. It was a very it was a very interesting and I can use the word cosmopolitan place. People came from various places. I had one incident that got me in some difficulty, and there's a story to it. We published a gag edition, and our gag edition was very critical of the then Premier of Alberta. We claimed that Ernest Manning was Amy Semple McPherson reincarnate. That's a long story, but anyway, the paper was confiscated, and there was a suggestion that I should cease my education at the University of Alberta. And by my understanding, the Dean of Law, Dean Wilbur Boker, came to my defense, and all they did was take half my honorarium, which was a total of $500 at that time. Anyway, I went to see Dean Boker, and I said, Dean Boker, I appreciate your defense of freedom of the press. And he said, young man, freedom of the press had nothing to do with this. I went to university with your mother, and she deserves better than this.
That's a wonderful story. That is fun. Well, I must tell you that many of the guests that we've had on this program have been invited to forestall their post-secondary education because of one prank or another. So there seems to be a thread there. Now, you had a friend at university who himself became a pretty famous Canadian political figure, albeit wearing a different color stripe. But Jim Coots came from your area of Alberta and ended up at the university with you, did he not?
He did. I ended up with him in that he went there first. I think he probably had the same narrow range of choices that I did. There was, we really didn't have a sense that, we knew there were universities elsewhere. We didn't have a sense that we could go to them. Jim, and I think both Jim and I, the late Jim, and I would put a bracket around the word friend or quotation marks around the word friend because we both took our political differences seriously. But one thing we had in common was that I arrived at U of A in 1957, and that was the year in which these sort of tests were being conducted to determine what profession or line of life you were best qualified to meet. They were in their very early days, these tests. Jim and I were required to take them. And so far as I know, we were the only two who had the same result as to what we were best prepared to do. But in each of our cases, it was recommended that we should be undertakers. Now, you figure that out if you can in terms of the lives we both went on to lead in public life.
Well, I did a similar thing a few years later, and I was told that I was most suited to be the manager of a chamber of commerce. So,
well, there you are.
Now, you were the national president of the Progressive Conservative student movement at that time, were you not, sir?
I was later on, yes. I took that office on in the early 60s. And that was in the Diefenbaker period.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story about that too, in that there was a sense that one of the candidates running for the presidency of the Progressive Conservative Student Federation was in fact an undercover member of the FLQ. And there was naturally a little bit of concern about that. I had not been planning to run, but the late Jean Bazin of Montreal and I literally tossed a coin. I'm not sure who I could say won, but I became the candidate, became the president of the Student Federation. It was fascinating. Political parties were very different then.
Yes.
They were very much more familial, if you were. And I was there in that position for 2.5 to 3 years of great turbulence and change and learning in the party and in the country.
Mm-hmm. It was a fascinating era in all political activities at that time.
Yeah.
Now, you worked as a journalist for a little while. You worked for the CBC and the Calgary Herald and the Edmonton Journal. What period of your life did that cover, sir?
That would have been in 57, 58, 59 in the summers. In 1960, I was with Canadian Press in Toronto.
Okay.
My first real exposure to Toronto, I have to say.
And then in the mid-60s, you went to work for the Alberta PC Party as an organizer for Peter Lougheed, who's become the new leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta.
Yeah,
Tell us about that experience.
In fact, I'd been involved in the provincial Progressive Conservative Party for quite a few years at that time. My dad was a member of that party, but didn't flaunt it because he was the editor of a weekly newspaper and had to keep as many friends as he could. But nonetheless, Peter Lougheed invited my dad and the late Louis Heinemann to put his name in nomination. And then on my own merit, I think I have to say, or my own foolishness, I agreed to become a field organizer, largely unpaid for Peter as he was trying to build, not so much rebuild, but build the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta. And it was that again exposed me to a wide range, to the diversity of a province that is regarded as being less diverse than in fact it is. It's a very interesting place, and I learned it from the ground up.
Now, in 67, you became a candidate in the provincial election.
There's a story there too, because I was in charge of finding candidates, and our candidate for the Calgary South constituency was the only one of our people rich enough to have afforded a pollster, and he had a pollster come out and take a look at that constituency, and he came back and reported that he'd never seen a constituency that was more difficult for an opposition candidate. So our candidate dropped out. The PC party had 2 members in that riding, but the High River Times, my dad's paper, had 67 subscribers. And I was able to persuade a number of them to come out, and I was nominated. I ran against the Speaker of the Legislature. That was Peter Lougheed's first campaign, first provincial election campaign. And we won 6 seats. Had we won 8, I would have been in the legislature, because we came quite close there. I was tempted on election night to call the pollster and say, you'd said this was, I guess he had told the predecessor candidate who asked, is this impossible? The pollster said, well, there was the virgin birth. So my telegram, which I never sent, was to him saying, come to Bethlehem and see. I was 200 and some votes short of being represented.
Oh, good for you. You then went on to work for another prominent Albertan politician, this time in Ottawa, Davy Fulton.
Davy was from Kamloops, from British Columbia, but I was privileged to work with him. Yeah, very privileged to work with him.
And then there was a leadership campaign. Robert Lawrence Stanfield became the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. And you and another prominent conservative went over and went to work for him.
Yeah, Lowell Murray and I did. Yes, we did.
And what was that like? there's a kind of an aura around Mr. Stanfield that he's regularly referred to as the best prime minister Canada never had. What was it like to work for him?
Well, he was an extraordinarily broad-minded person, and he was deeply committed to what I guess you'd call Canadian values, including those that were not always prominent in my party at that time, particularly official bilingualism. And at great peril to himself, I think, but in a real belief in principle, he became an active supporter of official languages. In fact, I've always argued that he defended the Official Languages Act out where it was tough, in the prairies and elsewhere. I was with him in some of those meetings, and they started with some hostility. And in part, it was the example of Robert Stanfield, as much as his arguments, that persuaded those Canadians who were skeptical, who had no direct experience with bilingualism, to support the practice. And that was consistent in his approach to matters. He was far-seeing, he was patient, and he was very easy and wise to work for. After we lost the 1968 election, I was with him somewhere at a fair in Ontario. We had dinner on the way back, and I had all these plans as to how we could get back in office quickly. And he listened to me patiently, and he said, "Well, Mr. Trudeau's just been elected. He's going to be there for 8 or 9 months and maybe longer. And I think we should hold our fire on the implementation of some of those plans," which was a wise thing to do, I thought. Mm-hmm. And he was a great healer of the party, and could have been of the country. Among his strengths was that he was able to draw upon significant support in that 1968 election from prominent Quebecers, people who were respectful of Stanfield, but were opponents of Mr. Trudeau. And rather than simply criticize the Liberal leader, they had enough confidence in Robert Stanfield that these people who were captains of industry, one was later appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, others stepped forward as candidates. We've never had that class of candidates again, and I consider that to be a tribute to Robert L.
Mm-hmm. Now, you ran yourself as a candidate in the 1972 election from a riding in Alberta, and you were to begin then the first of 21 years of consecutive service in the House of Commons.
I did. I ran in Rocky Mountain constituency. It itself ran from the U.S. border up to nearly the Peace River country, a very large constituency. In summertime, there is a connecting road. In wintertime, then the Banff-Jasper Highway was not open, so you had to go outside the constituency to get from one end to the other. But again, it was a remarkably diverse constituency, in part because it included 3 or 4 coal mining towns who had drawn miners from literally around the world. And some of those were really vivacious communities. They'd gone through bad times by the time I was a candidate, but they were wonderful communities in the Crow's Nest Pass and Grand Cache, out of Hinton and Edson, in Canmore. And I learned an immense amount from that period, both campaigning. I won a contested nomination, but also as the member of Parliament.
Now, you served as an MP for 4 years, and then in 1976, you stood for election as the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. And that was a fascinating convention for a political junkie like me. That was intriguing because there were a lot of big name candidates, and many candidates whose fortunes in the outcome didn't reflect what their hopes had been as they went in. Pat Nowlin doing very poorly, Flora MacDonald getting a couple of hundred votes when she expected 700. And you finished third in that voting behind Claude Bogner and Brad Mulroney. You then kept climbing up the ballot And in the end, on the final ballot, you had succeeded defeating Claude Wagner for the leadership of the party. You were described as a dark horse candidate, and I'm sure our viewers would be interested in knowing how it came about that you ended up in reflection. How do you think it came about that you ended up as the leader when you were third on the first ballot?
Well, I think there were two factors, really. One is I wasn't my first choice for the leadership of the party. What I tried hard to do was encourage Peter Lougheed to stand for office, for that office. And he had made his commitment to Alberta, was not yet premier then, and declined. So I then began to look at the capacity, not simply the character, but the capacity to draw on all sources of the party, and thought that I had an unusual chance, a long shot, but nonetheless, I was not wasting anybody's time by being a candidate. And Maureen and I canvassed the country extensively. We drew a lot of support from various pockets. I had strong support in Alberta. I had strong support in Eastern and Northern Ontario because of Maureen's dad, John McTeer, who had been active in the provincial party for a long time. But all that added up to third place. All that and other things added up to third place. And then the second thing I'd like to underline about that is that the Progressive Conservative Party at that time really was a family. It was a diverse family, but it had learned to respect people with hard views, had learned to respect one another. In fact, I can't think of, as leader later, I said there was nobody whose support I wouldn't seek. I thought our purpose was to reflect the whole country. And the party at that time had come to do that. And I think that consciously or unconsciously, it thought that was an important quality. I'd been known in the party much more than someone my age should have been, because I'd been national student president and all of these things. And I guess I have to say I was trusted, not enthusiastically as a first choice, but as someone who could respect where the party came from, had a pan-Canadian point of view, and had not acquired a lot of enemies along the way. And so as people got past their first choices, my candidacy came to look more and more attractive. The other thing that we did was emphasize policy. Again, I owe a lot of this to Maureen, because she was at law school at the University of Alberta, at University of Ottawa. And 3 or 4 of the other people who were there, assistant profs and this sort of thing, were interested in public policy. And she asked one of them to, if they'd offer some advice gratis to a candidate. Right. And we had a very strong policy team. And in a normal, these days, I'm not sure that matters very much. Where it mattered at the convention was that there was a series of quite intense policy discussions prior to the vote.
Yes.
And because of that team and my briefers, I was able to be more creative and competitive on policy questions than some of my colleagues. So those circumstances came together. As I say, we made a calculated decision that there was a prospect of my winning. I wasn't running to show. I thought that the party, frankly, needed someone who could be a consolidator, and I thought I could do that. But also, I thought that given the party and the times as they were, I had a reasonable shot. Well, I had a long shot at winning, and that is what happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to make full disclosure here, because I don't want anyone to think I'm not forthcoming about this. The next little bit of your history we actually shared, because I was elected to the national executive as national vice president, and then as served as national treasurer. So your term as leader and my term on the national executive were sort of coincidental. And so just so that nobody can say I've got a hidden interest in all of this, I'll declare it up front.
And I'm not asking you how you voted.
Well, you and others might be interested that my friend Doug Lewis and I, and Doug later became the MP from this area, did a little analysis on the way to Ottawa as to what would happen as each candidate dropped off. And we actually had you winning on the fourth ballot. Now, nobody in hindsight will believe that, but Doug will vouch for me. You won on the fourth ballot, and we had you as the second choice of a lot of the delegates as others dropped off. So,
well, Doug, in fact, later on, Doug played a really historic role in the future of the country, I think. When the National Energy Program was brought in, it was fiercely opposed in Western Canada. And there was a risk for our national party that we would be seen as focused only upon one region. Doug went around his constituency. He was a diligent member of parliament, and he found a small industry there that was going to lose 20-some jobs at least, which would be more than half its workforce if the National Energy Program came in. That made the National Energy Program issue a national issue. Right. Not simply an Albertan, not simply a Western issue. And that allowed us to pursue it with far more vigor. And we didn't stop it from happening, but we put up a heavy fight. And in the end, and later, when Brian was elected as Prime Minister, changing that policy was one of our first orders of priority. That probably would not have happened without Doug's determination to first know his own constituency, but realize the need for a national approach to some of these issues.
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Let's skip to the 79 election, May of 1979. Your platform was described as being a small C conservative platform. You were running against Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who had been Prime Minister for quite some time at that point, and you were successful. You won a minority government, 136 seats to 114 for the Liberals. And you were sworn in the day before your 40th birthday, wasn't it?
I was. Mm-hmm.
And notwithstanding what some people would think is the case with the current Prime Minister, you continue to be the youngest Prime Minister to ever serve this country.
Yes, I'm proud of that.
You were also the first Prime Minister born and raised in the prairies.
Yes.
And that continues to be the case.
That's a quite interesting phenomenon. I hadn't really realized that before. I hadn't looked at the history of everybody. And a lot of people who went on to be Prime Minister had experience in Western Canada. Mr. Diefenbaker became the incarnation, in effect, of Western Canada. Arthur Meehan had been a candidate in Manitoba. Stephen Harper lived in Calgary. So we had all of those things happening. And I knew I was the first Albertan to have been leader of the party. It hadn't really occurred to me until recently that I was the first person born and raised in the prairies. Now, is that important? Is it relevant? It is, because I think people generally misunderstand the extent of the sense of being a newcomer, stroke outsider of prairie Canadians to the whole of the country. And I don't want to dwell on that at length, but it is the fact that every other region has had prime ministers born and raised there, and the prairies has been limited to my not quite a year in office. That, I think, is a factor worth bearing in mind when we're looking at the various forces of regional culture that are an inescapable part of Canadian reality.
Interesting. Now, it was an interesting period when you were serving because it was a minority government, and those are always difficult to manage. There was the famous non-confidence vote on 13 December 1979. It was a vote on John Crosby's austerity budget, and that vote was lost by 6 votes. Mm-hmm. Social credit, the creditees had supported you earlier and abstained on that vote, and some of your own members were away. In hindsight, what would you have done differently?
Oh, and it's a hindsight I've indulged, I'll tell you. We made a serious mistake regarding the creditees, and part of that was that we wanted to reestablish the natural roots of the Progressive Conservative Party in Quebec. And we knew that in order to do that, we had to win some of the Créditiste seats. So that was in the back of our mind. And that sort of longer plan got in the way of my short-term examination of what we should do on the vote. And who knows if we would have been successful in bringing some of them. One of their members, Monsieur Journal, joined across the floor to sit with us, but that was a miscalculation. And the other, we took a risk on the Crosby budget, a risk worth running, I believe. It would have made a difference in public policy for a long time to come, but we knew that it was going to be a gamble. And as to some of the absent members, well, one of them was Flora, who of course was a great supporter of mine, but she was foreign minister then, and she literally could not get back in time from an international conference in Europe to vote. And the others, I think there were various reasons why they weren't there, but no party is ever entirely happy with its leader. And I think that one or two of them didn't have the incentive to come. So the upshot was, I do not blame anyone else. I've made it a clear point of saying that I was the leader. I made the call. I made the mistake. And that is also true. The Prime Minister is the final decider in these kinds of questions. And there's no real point dwelling on what would have happened if something different had occurred. It didn't. I regret it, obviously. I think that we had a great cabinet, a cabinet that was formed in large measure by Mr. Stanfield's work, the people he recruited into office. And I think we would have made a very significant difference had we been able to stay in office.
I must tell you how refreshing it is to hear a political leader actually take responsibility for anything these days. That doesn't happen very much. So yeah, congratulations to you for that. The 1980 election, Mr. Trudeau had suggested he was resigning, stepping down as leader, and then suddenly had a reincarnation and ended up leading the Liberals to a majority, and you and he swapped houses in Ottawa.
We did. He played a very cautious campaign. I called it his peekaboo campaign. You rarely saw him. And the Liberal Party was wise enough to realize that we had earned some demerits. The glow was off us by that time. And so they kept him out of sight. They kept the memories that had caused him to lose in '79 out of public consciousness. And they succeeded. They also were the natural governing party in the country. And we'd been able to break that in '79. Mr. Duesenbaker had been able to break it earlier, but it was still a dominant factor in the country. And we were not as competitive in the province of Quebec in either of those elections as we needed to be. And it's very difficult to win a national campaign if you start with a large province like that with so few prospects.
Let me just, your career goes on far beyond that era, so we want to just keep going. But you did serve as opposition leader for a couple of years. You received strong support from the party at a couple of national meetings. And then when there was a call for a leadership convention, you said that 70% of the support of the party wasn't enough and agreed to a leadership campaign. And then there was a convention in 1983 with a number of candidates. You led on the first three ballots again, which I think is a tribute to the leadership that you provided to the party. On the fourth ballot, you lost out to the ultimate leader, Brian Mulroney. And again, to your credit, if I may say so, sir, you remained and became the Secretary of State for External Affairs and were one of the best ministers in that portfolio this country has seen. I wonder if you might talk to us about your approach to that, because you brought a special point of view to your service to the country in that role.
Well, I believe parties have to reflect the country. They have to be as broad as possible, and they have to integrate sometimes opposites. And I thought that I had demonstrated that capacity. I think it was recognized in the party. I don't think people voted against me because I was a reconciler. I think they voted against me because they thought that Brian would have a better, at the end of the day, that Brian would have the better chance of being able to win an election later on. It was my party, it's my country. My own term as leader and as prime minister had been shorter than I would have wanted it to be. I thought I had things to contribute. He, to his credit, despite the advice, the natural advice of a lot of his more fervent partisans, appointed me to a very senior position at Foreign Affairs, gave me a lot of latitude to function there. And I think, in fact, if one looks back over the history of parties in Canada, there is no better example of people who had been opponents in a leadership campaign working together in the party's and the country's interests the way that Brian Mulroney and I did. And but I'd lost an election. I'd not lost my sense that I could be of service and of value to the country. And given that opportunity, I decided to run again. I also believed one of the slogans we'd used in the campaign that I lost was that we had to put the broader interest ahead of the narrow interest. And I remember shortly after my defeat, I said to my supporters that those of us who had called for loyalty in the past have to demonstrate it now. And it was important for me to do that too, because a fair number of my own supporters, no one likes losing. They don't even like having their candidate lose. And I think it contributed to the viability of the National Party at that time.
You also really reinforced Canada's role in multilateralism during that time. You had an expression about how Canada leads that I think is worth repeating.
Well, we are a multilateral country. We talk about multilateral relations as though they deal with other countries. They do, but they also deal with other cultures. And we really have been more successful than almost any other country I can mention in being able to respect and draw together quite different parts. Part of that internationally was that we didn't try to throw our views or our weight around. The phrase you referred to is leading from beside. I believe that is the great strength of Canadian diplomacy under any government. We cannot force others to do things. We can be respected. We are respected across a much wider range than most countries, much wider range. And we have to keep earning that respect by demonstrating that we respect people who have views and backgrounds other than ours. So that question, that Canadian capacity to lead from beside, that the idea that you can make a difference without being always at the head of the table, I think is a critical part, not only of our past, but it's an increasingly critical part of the role that we can play in a world that is more troubled and more divided now, and less willing to be told what to do by countries that presume to be powers.
You received a high compliment for the work that you did in that portfolio, really across parties. And in your next position, which was as Minister of Constitutional Affairs, you had considerable success. And I wonder if you could just briefly tell us about the era in which you served and the role that you played.
Well, when I look back at it, and I've been very lucky in the things I've done, I think the area where I've most made a difference may well have been in the Charlottetown process, because we did need to bring people together. And in order to bring them together, you couldn't insist on a narrow or single set of issues. You had to genuinely respect, on the one hand, respect what others were doing. And secondly, you had to create a circumstance in which people which more people respected difference. It's natural that you respect it to some degree, but when it comes down to making concessions, to agreeing on a compromise, there needs to be an atmosphere and an encouragement. Charlottetown, in its product, in its result, had all sorts of weaknesses. It wasn't a perfect document. It was the only constitutional accord Canadians have achieved that was approved unanimously, not only by all the provinces, all the territories and the federal government, but also by the 4 national Indigenous groups that were around the table. Mm-hmm. None of that was easy. It all took time. Undoubtedly, there were mistakes. There were things we could have done that we didn't do, but by and large, we were able to create an atmosphere and stay at it that yielded a result. At the end of the day, it went to a referendum, and there was enough in that broad package for different people to contest that we lost it. But I think it was a demonstration of the capacity of Canadians when we sit down and try to listen to one another, including Canadians in power, including governments, and including groups with real grievances like our Indigenous people. One of the important factors in Charlottetown was not simply that the non-Indigenous community agreed on issues. The Indigenous community agreed on some real and important, call them concessions. They moved off their preferred position to seek a national advantage. That's, again, a quality that is more necessary in our country and in our world than it has been at many times before. And what's interesting about Charlottetown, with all of the agony and all of the problems, is that we proved it can be done. We proved that unanimity can be found on a wide range of issues. And indeed, we persuaded one another. It wasn't somebody coming in and offering an instruction and then wielding some kind of power to make sure it was achieved. We persuaded one another. We came to common ground by discussion and by choice. And again, in a world like ours, that is increasingly a necessary practice and, I suppose, example.
Mm-hmm. That process was an exhausting one for you. You were bringing so many disparate interests together. And when it was all over, you chose not to run in the 1993 election. Was that because of the process you'd been through?
Well, it was because of my disappointment. And I'm not saying I was angry and walked away. I just felt that I'd always had an enthusiasm for acting, for drawing people together. I think I can say I've done that through my career. And that experience sapped my enthusiasm. I would not have been able in the subsequent election to have approached my public responsibilities, either as campaigning or as a member of parliament, with the same determination and enthusiasm as I had before. And it weighed on me for quite a while. But life goes on. And but that's the principal reason that I decided not to run in the next election.
But you did make a comeback in 1998. Then leader Jean Charest announced he would leave the federal scene to go into Quebec politics, and you were again elected as the federal PC leader in, I guess, late '98. What was the condition of the party at that point?
It was an emaciated party. It had been, I think, for quite a while before. Jean Charest demonstrated that it could be a live national force again. And he was then, probably in the nation's interest, encouraged to leave the federal scene to defend and express federalist forces in Quebec. And he had, among other things, he'd elected a very talented caucus. There weren't very many, but there were some very able people there. And so we had a second chance. The country needs competitive political leadership. It needs choices. And my view was that we were the best natural choice. The Bloc Québécois was a factor then. And I believe that we had the capacity to be a strong national alternative. We weren't able to do that. We were simply too weakened a force at that time. And of course, the Reform Party had been created. It's interesting to me that the Reform Party, the people who encouraged the Reform Party did not challenge Mr. Diefenbaker when he was leader of the party as a Western Canadian. They didn't challenge the party when Mr. Stanfield led it. They didn't challenge it when I led it. And that was partly because Mr. Stanfield was seen, if you're not a Western Canadian, being an Atlantic Canadian is the next best thing.
Yeah.
And both Mr. Diefenbaker and I had strong Western connections.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that there wasn't anger elsewhere. In your own province of Ontario, they won a seat in that the 1993 election, but they were really a protest movement at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to protest than it is to cohese. And I think that I was concerned that attitude of protest would become endemic. Now, the national parties, when you and I were active in one of them, were very broad families. We practiced respect internally, not always, but we drew various forces together. And what's happened now, for a variety of reasons, a lot of it is the means of communication, the internet, and it's giving voice to a worry Mr. Stanfield expressed. He said the growth of interest groups is going to cause a real challenge to national political parties, because parties are designed to draw interests together. Specific interest groups are designed to make their own point. And to a large degree now, the affiliations of Canadians are to legitimate interests in which they're engaged. But that is at the cost of finding reconciliation. In my view, none of our three national parties is as representative as it was or as it needs to be as an instrument of reconciliation in Canada. That's an issue that needs to be explored. I hope to say some things about it again later on, but I think it's a major change in the nature of Canada's capacity to govern itself in a respectful, successful way.
In the early part of this millennium, there was a movement afoot to join together the Progressive Conservative Party and the Reform Party, the United Alternative Movement. Very briefly, because we are time limited always, but very briefly, you chose not to support that. Can you explain why?
Yes, I thought it was going to be narrow, and I believe it turned out to be too narrow. And we'll see what happens now. The party now has a new leader who comes, interestingly, originally from a progressive conservative tradition. That's where I first met Aaron. And he's taken some early actions that indicates that he wants to not reform that, not recreate that approach, but respect it more than it had been before. But at that time, I thought it would be a mistake. I couldn't understand why any Canadian would want to reject the idea of being progressive. But I do understand the sentiments that were afoot now, and I simply think that we need to find in all our parties an approach that reaches beyond our favorite interests and tries to draw people together.
Good for you. I do want to spend a moment on life after politics, although there's been a political overtone to much of what you've done since you left politics. You were an international observer in elections in many parts of the world: Pakistan, Dominican Republic, Cameroon, Mexico, Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, Nigeria. Tell us very briefly, if you will, what does an international observer do?
What it does is try to understand what is really happening and try to show some kind of spotlight upon things that should not be happening. What it can't do is support one party or another. We are there as observers. And we have to be seen as independent observers.
Mhm.
And in most cases, we were. I've had some quite remarkable experiences in terms of finding ways in which, in countries of which I was not a native, one could bring factions together, at least to define an issue in a similar way, if not trying to respond to it. And it's really essential in a lot of the developing countries to have outside sources who can be trusted as to how their system is working. And at its best, that's what election observers do.
You served as vice chair of a nonprofit organization that provides global leadership to governments of developing nations. Again, very briefly, and I apologize for the time constraints we're under, but what is the role of that organization?
Well, we are now 45 members, most of us former heads of government. We offer discreet advice to serving governments as to how they might approach a problem they identify. We do not advertise our advice. We very often, when we go into a country where there are problems, talk to the government about where there are deficiencies that they could, if they wanted to, address. And on some occasions, we help them do that. But we are advisory. We are looking at now some 20 circumstances where we might become involved. Very often, those might be's turn out to be no thank you. But it is the application of experience by people who have actually led governments in a wide array of countries, not just the developed West, but a wide array of countries.
You have an international consulting firm that you head in Ottawa. You sit on a number of boards. You've done some lecturing in Canada and the US. I understand you're still doing some teaching from time to time?
From time to time I am, a little less under COVID, but I had the luxury of going into other people's classes, addressing a particular problem and not having to mark papers.
Perfect.
So it's been very pleasant. It kept me in touch with a lot of people. But I'm privileged to be involved on a couple of boards that are quite far-reaching and expand my knowledge.
You've written a couple of books, and I wonder, again, briefly, if you could just tell us what the themes of those two books were.
Well, I suppose the first one was about national unity, and it was called A Country Too Good to Lose. And the point of that was we had to work at keeping it. The second was about how we respond to the challenges of the 20th century, how we lead, how a country like Canada can lead. And it really comes back to some of the issues we've been talking about here, having the necessity of identifying real differences and making real efforts to find common ground.
Good for you. You have received a number of recognitions, Companion of the Order of Canada, Alberta Order of Excellence, an award from the International Association of French-Speaking Nations. You're an honorary chief of the Samson Cree First Nation, and you're the first recipient of the Vimy Award. I'm not sure that all of our viewers will know about that. What's the Vimy Award?
I was privileged to be the first recipient, and it has to do with people who have made a significant contribution to resolving conflict in the world, often resolving conflict through formal means like support for our armed forces, but also in a broader way. And I was honored to be, it was created as the Gulf War was ending. And I was privileged to be foreign minister during that time, and very much appreciated the distinction.
Now, just to bring us up to date on the family, what is Maureen doing these days?
Maureen is involved with not just teaching law, but also focusing on some questions relating to gender and research at the University of Ottawa and elsewhere. She's written, about 8 or 9 years ago, she wrote a book, Living and Dying in the 21st Century, which was ahead of its time. And she's been asked by her publisher, I hope I'm not betraying any confidence, asked by her publisher to renew that book, because the topic is very active. And we are both indulging in a new career of grandparenting. which she does with often more skill than I do. But she remains very active and engaged in public life. And I mentioned before how much I guess this is not the right word. Our association together has allowed me to move forward as much as it has. I owe her a lot.
Your daughter, Catherine, I know she was in media, in journalism. Is she still doing that?
She's still in media. She's doing a lot of Master of Ceremonies work and a lot of media advice on a lot of things. What she very much enjoyed was when she worked for CPAC and was an interviewer. She's an extraordinary interviewer and was, in fact, former Chief Justice McLaughlin asked her at a time when there was concern about who are judges apart from the robes they wear, suggested to Catherine that she interview each of the judges of the Supreme Court, which Catherine did, the first person, I think, ever to do that. This was a father speaking, but they were great interviews. She also interviewed all of the then former prime ministers, and again, showed a great skill in bringing out our differences and our qualities. So she has a great gift as an interviewer and a communicator, and I have to say as a mother, because Alexandra and Charlie are, any grandfather would say this, are really great kids, and they owe a lot to her and to Chad's guidance and leadership. So a proud father I am.
Well done, well done. Well, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our viewers. We always appreciate you tuning into this program. We want to thank the Rogers Television technical support staff who make this possible, and also the staff at the MCC who help us with production. This program is made possible thanks to the series sponsorship of Bales and Dishaw Wealth Management. Thanks to Kathy Bales, and thanks to Arnold and Patty DeCarly for their program support. Special thanks to you, Mr. Clark. It's great to reconnect with you, and I found the last hour fascinating, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Privilege.
This program is presented by the Midland Cultural Center. We used to do these programs live before an audience. We now do them on this Zoom platform because the MCC is closed due to government regulations. If you've enjoyed the program, we would love to have you make a donation on the MCC website, because we do need to keep that facility and be ready to reopen when conditions permit. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time when our guest is the actress Sheila McCarthy. Bye-bye for now.